start. This is part 2 of my reviewing the material in my new book, DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. It's mostly a presentation of the material that I discussed at 2 events in Santa Fe in May of 2015, one at the Arc Bookstore and the other at Collected Works Bookstore. At the end of the first lecture or video from last month, I finished up with discussing how both Zen Buddhist theory and theology and that of Latin American shamanism, and in that case the ethical and moral shortcomings of their system, or at least of their practitioners, were problematic in offering an optimal model for the spiritual properties of the DMT state. Let me talk a little more about Buddhism before I move on to the Hebrew Bible's notion of prophecy as the one I have settled on as a viable alternative. I parted ways with my Zen community over publicly discussing the relationship between psychedelic drugs and Zen practice. But before that, and I suppose even continuing to this day, I am indebted to Zen Buddhist practice and study for being where I am now with respect to beliefs about the psychedelic, in particular DMT state. I entered my DMT research with Zen Buddhism as the practical and theoretical scaffolding through which to view the ultimate effect of the DMT experience. I had begun studying under the tutelage of a Western Zen order in 1974 and continued practicing with them in various forms and levels of involvement over the following 22 years. My interest in Buddhism and psychedelics came from noticing similarities in descriptions of the psychedelic drug state with those resulting from the practice of Eastern religious meditation techniques. To the extent that they resembled each other, I reasoned that there must be some common underlying biology. Both my reading of the Buddhist literature and discussions with junior monks at the training monastery confirmed this relationship, as nearly every young monk had their first flash of enlightenment on LSD, a flash that they were then determined to solidify and integrate within a religious way of life, one that seemed consistent, at least at first, with the worldview glimpsed under the effect of a psychedelic drug. In a related manner, the Buddhist community provided continual support and interest in my attempts to understand the relationship between the psychedelic drug state and spiritual practice. This became more problematic once my research actually began, but up until then, conversations with members of the community were integral in supporting and developing my ideas along these lines. Our method of supervising DMT sessions was heavily influenced by Zen. My nurse and I tried to maintain a semi-meditative state while volunteers were undergoing their DMT experiences. We sat quietly, focusing on our breath, my breath, her breath, alert to but unobtrusively attending to the environment and responding to the volunteer when necessary. This provided the volunteer with a minimally intrusive, bare-bones Zen, quote-unquote, environment within which to fully encounter the DMT worlds in a safe container on their own. I also used notions from Buddhist psychology, part of the tradition called Abhidharma, in helping volunteers extricate themselves from any entanglements in the DMT state. For example, if a volunteer seemed unable to break through the curtain of colors found in the initial stages of the drug effect, it proved helpful to teach them how to withdraw their attention just enough to provide the fluidity necessary for the movement of their awareness to the next level. This is based on the Buddhist psychological notion of the 12 steps of dependent origination. And it has to do with pulling your attention back from making contact after having vaguely perceived the object that is presenting itself to you. The paper and pencil rating scale that we developed to quantify the DMT effect was also influenced by Abhidharma psychology. I studied with an advanced Tibetan Lama one summer many years previously as a medical school elective, and one of my first publications was on Abhidharma psychology, based on what I had learned that summer. I used my knowledge of what are called skandhas, or the heaps that comprise what is consolidated as ongoing subjective experience, to develop the categories to quantify the drug state. These are the familiar form, feeling, consciousness, perception, cognition, and volitional habits. Okay, why don't you, Kenneth, let's break there. And why don't you start with, or why don't you finish with habits, and let me count down to begin the next section. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The Zen Buddhist goal of enlightenment was also the sought-after endpoint of the high-dose DMT effect, both in my mind as well as in the minds of my volunteers, a large number of whom were practitioners of Eastern meditation. We expected a formless, content-free, nonverbal, personality-free experience of emptiness, a total identification with the underlying source and foundation of existence. This was where theory and data began to diverge, inasmuch as the DMT experience was nearly always full of content, often verbal. One's personality was highly maintained, and rather than identification with emptiness, was a robust and fulsome interaction with the contents of the state. Another problem with the Buddhist approach was its treatment of the visions and voices as fundamentally unreal. This was in striking contrast to the experience of the volunteers, nearly all of whom testified to the striking reality of what they had just apprehended, perhaps even feeling more real than everyday reality, and certainly not a dream or hallucination. Taking a Buddhist approach, no matter how unspoken, interfered with my volunteers' comfort in fully disclosing some of the most interesting aspects of their experiences, because they felt I was not quite believing what they were telling me. And finally, once I began writing about the confluence of Buddhism and psychedelic drug effects, even how they did not necessarily relate to each other very well, the rupture of my relationship with the Zen community made it possible to begin exploring other spiritual models that might be more compatible with the data from my DMT studies. This ultimately led to my present work comparing the DMT effect to that of the prophetic state as described in the Hebrew Bible. It's interesting that I was able to work through my resistance to the Hebrew Bible's notion of God, usually the biggest stumbling block to any serious study of the text, using some of what I'd learned from Zen. I had attained my first toehold in understanding God's existence, nature, and activities by positing that God created and sustains the laws of cause and effect. God, in this way of thinking, exists before cause and effect, will exist after cause and effect, and exists outside of cause and effect. This had to do with my questioning the eternality of cause and effect, which essentially teaches that everything is impermanent. In other words, there must be something that created and sustains cause and effect, because cause and effect teaches that everything, including itself, has a beginning and an end. So there needed to be something outside of cause and effect that was eternal and creative. In addition, the Jewish medievalists' notion that natural and moral law derive from the same source, that is, God, allowed me to understand why cause and effect is a certain way and not another way. That is, why does cause and effect seem to favor particular thoughts and actions and discourages others? That is, both natural law, the laws of nature, and the moral laws, which we call reward and punishment, but which are basically just an anthropomorphized way of describing cause and effect, both reflect the will and the wisdom of their single creator and sustainer. After these insights, it was much easier to relate to the Hebrew Bible and its unique notion of God. So once I examined and set aside Buddhism and Latin American shamanism as cogent alternative models for the DMT state, I returned to my roots and began looking at the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament for an alternative model. This text is the foundational text for all three so-called Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, whose members number 1/2 of the world's population. Once I began to read the text, the notion of a prophetic state began to appear. By prophecy, I mean any spiritual experience had by any figure in the text. Usually we think of prophecy as predicting or foretelling. However, this is an artifact of the Greek translation of the Hebrew word for prophet, navi, to prophetes, or one who speaks before something happens. This is an example of the Greek interpretation of the text, rather than a strict translation. The Greek was the first non-Hebrew rendition of the Old Testament and served as the forerunner for many subsequent translations into, for example, Latin, German, Syriac, etc. The Greeks valued highly altered states of consciousness for their ability to divine or predict, so-called divination. But the Hebrew word, or the Hebrew root, from which the word navi, or prophet, comes from, means to communicate or to interpret, to be elevated in stature, even to bubble up, but it has nothing to do with prediction. Prediction may occur in prophetic experience in the Hebrew Bible, but is neither necessary nor sufficient for the definition. Many prophetic figures did not predict. Many prophetic predictions never came to pass, and many predictions may come to pass that are attained by means other than prophecy. I began carefully studying the Hebrew Bible with the aid of medieval Jewish philosophers, a group of writers who lived between 800 and 1700 AD, or CE, Common Era. These commentators were rabbis, primarily, who were also steeped in the secular knowledge of their time, such as grammar, mathematics, astronomy, logic, music, medicine, and so on. Thus, they were able to interpret the text in a way that both made sense and was consistent with the use of the Hebrew language. Without the aid of the medieval Jewish philosophers and commentators, the Hebrew text is incomprehensible. I searched for examples in the Hebrew Bible of prophetic state similarities to those of my DMT volunteers. In this effort, I used the categories I had developed during the drug study, such as perceptual effects, modification of emotions, thinking, will or volition, and physical effects. The similarities were extraordinarily strong, especially in the perceptual sphere. Nevertheless, there seemed to be a greater degree of richness in the prophetic literature, and upon further consideration, this appeared to reside in a category of relatedness, of the interactions between the experient and the contents of the spiritual state. The major function of the relationship between the contents of the state, of both the DMT effect and prophecy, and the contents that usually do this relating are the beings, the so-called beings in both states, is to communicate information. This then led me to what is being communicated. In the case of the text, the message of the Hebrew Bible, a prophetic text, and I subsequently developed categories for the prophetic message. This primarily relates to the two fundamental messages of the Hebrew Bible: the existence, nature, and activities of the one God, and the Golden Rule. In other words, how to understand and relate to the spiritual world, and how to understand and relate to this world, ourselves, our community, and the natural world. Let's start with, in other words. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. In other words, how to understand and relate to the spiritual world, and how to understand and relate to this world, ourselves, our community, and the natural world. For example, the Hebrew Bible teaches that God is powerful, not weak. Therefore, whenever I came upon a report from my DMT notes that referred to the power of God, I would place that example in the Bible-based category. Or if someone in the DMT state referred to attaining insights regarding empathy with his or her fellow, I would place that into the Golden Rule category. The richness of the prophetic message is apparent in the influence of the Hebrew Bible on Western and world culture, law, ethics and morality, theology, philosophy, economics, psychology, aesthetics, agriculture, natural science, and so on. On the other hand, the DMT state in particular, and the psychedelic state in general, at least from my perspective, has not provided a correspondingly novel set of ideas as much as a new aesthetic, as manifest in computer graphics, the arts, music, and so on. While the existence of the DMT state, its nature and properties, were meticulously detailed by our volunteers, the message contained in it was much less highly articulated. This, of course, is open to debate. One of my colleagues, Ralph Abraham, a UC Santa Cruz mathematician, who freely admits having consumed about a quarter pound of DMT over a short period of time in the 1960s, and as a result developed the field of visual mathematics, believes that the DMT state is full of information. However, it may be mathematical rather than verbal in nature. I discussed mechanisms of the DMT effect using a system of metaphysics developed by the medieval Jewish philosophers. I also develop ideas regarding the mechanisms of prophecy, taking into account the presence of and effects of DMT. I suggest that elevations in endogenous, or naturally produced in the body, DMT, in figures in the Hebrew Bible experiencing prophecy, mediated the phenomenology of that state, the visions and the voices. The medievalists would consider this to be a case of the stimulation of the imaginative faculty, the imagination being the location in the mind where the visions, voices, emotions, and so on are displayed. At the same time, DMT in this model does not proportionately stimulate the rational faculty or the intellect, which deals with more abstract notions such as ideas, concepts, theories, and so on. In the prophetic state, on the other hand, both the intellect and imagination are highly active, and the intellect is able to extract the information contained in the visions and the voices. The imagination is the more physical of the two faculties and can be affected by diet, health, genetics, and is less modifiable, however, by the than the rational faculty. The intellect is the more spiritual or non-physical faculty and can be trained by education and moral discipline. Please note that I'm not suggesting that prophetic figures in the Hebrew Bible took drugs, although there are theories speculating that this was the case. For example, marijuana in the sacred incense, DMT in the burning acacia plant that may have been the species beheld by Moses at the time of his initial epiphany, ergot alkaloids in the manna of the desert. The presence and properties of endogenous DMT make such hypothesizing unnecessary. However, we must address the origin of this potential or theoretical elevation of endogenous DMT. This is where my new model comes into play. The reigning model of the biology of spiritual experience is that of neurotheology, which is a bottom-up model, proposing that the brain responds with a reflex to various stimuli, resulting in a change of consciousness that is retrospectively considered spiritual. These stimuli include meditation, prayer, fasting, and even psychedelic drugs. The spiritual experience is generated by the brain and generates the impression of communicating with the divine. My new model is a top-down one, what I call theoneurology. In this model, it is God who designed the human brain as the agent through which to communicate with us. Divine influence, somehow, elevates endogenous DMT levels through metaphysical means, which at some point may be explicated objectively, scientifically. The forms of the visions and the voices are intended to transmit certain prophetic information, and the highly developed and perhaps even similarly divinely stimulated intellect then extracts information from the contents of the imagination. In the neurotheology model, spiritual experience is good for us, making us more altruistic, creative, and so on. In the theoneurology model, the prophetic state, and in particular the information contained by it, may not necessarily be good for us, at least in the short run, particularly when the message is that of social chastisement and reproof, and a gloomy future if we don't improve our ways. It is of interest to note that very few, if any, of the Hebrew Bible's prophetic figures experience joy, ecstasy, or bliss in their prophetic state. In fact, few, if any, sought out the experience because of the burden associated with the prophetic mission. This contrasts with those who seek enlightenment through meditational practices or psychedelic drugs, in which case the non-relational and unitive state is sought after, providing an alternative to the difficult interactions facing us continually in our homes, communities, and within ourselves. There are practical applications for this theory, one of which is that those seeking a model for understanding and integrating the spiritual properties of the psychedelic drug state consider the Hebrew Bible as an interpretive key for these purposes. For example, knowing how to interact with angels, how to distinguish between various aspects of God, proper preparation intellectually and ethically, interpreting and applying the information apprehended during the psychedelic state, etc., all might be made easier and more fruitful as a result of training one's intellect by studying and comprehending the Hebrew Bible. The other side of the coin is to consider the judicious use of psychedelic substances in the context of studying the Hebrew Bible in order to attain a closer proximity to the state of mind out of which the text emerged. The Hebrew Bible is a record of prophetic experience compiled by those with prophetic inspiration. If one wishes to enhance the imaginative capacity, to provide more imaginal content for the intellect to work with, psychedelic drug-induced enhancement of the imagination could be useful. Of course, this must occur under the strictest supervision possible. Such studies are already taking place at centers like Johns Hopkins, where clerics and other religious figures, including Jewish and Christian ones, are being administered psilocybin so as to enhance their spiritual sensibilities. I think there are also similar studies taking place at New York University. One last topic I would like to bring up is that of false prophecy. There are various criteria, all of which are somewhat vague and dynamic, presented in the Hebrew Bible and by the medieval Jewish philosophers. What appears to be a defining characteristic is that true prophecy doesn't contain anything that expressly contravenes the notion of the one God or the Golden Rule. False prophecy is relevant to the psychedelic state because we want to be able to gauge whether what we are experiencing ourselves or what others experience in the psychedelic state is worth attending to or not, whether it improves the lot of ourselves and the world, or simply contributes to more delusion and confusion. Stop.